Okay. Well, thank you everybody for joining in Open Source Cowboy Podcast, episode 6. I'm here with my good friend Andrew Aitken. He's a big industry expert. Some people know him from Hedera days, FINOS, and some more. He helped peer review my whole Possum white paper and gave me some good feedback for the second edition of that. So why don't you give a quick intro to yourself, Andrew?
Sure. Hi, Christian. Thanks for having me on your podcast. And someday you need to come out and do it from where I live in Durango, Colorado. This is where this is a cowboy town besides a ski town. And so it'd be great to have you out here doing one of your podcasts. So I've been in Andrew Aitken. I've been in open source for almost, hate to admit, around 25 years. Always on the business and strategy side. And so early on, I was with a venture-backed startup that was building a web app server that didn't really go anywhere. Those were during some of the heydays when money was really easy to come by. And so we built this startup and built this web app server that didn't go anywhere. During the first .com bust, that company folded. I actually came back in and bought the assets out. And then launched a consulting company called Alliance Group. And it was the first kind of boutique, call it the McKinsey or Bain or Booz Allen or BCG of open source. And so we did strategy consulting. In those days, it was really when you talk to people about open source, everyone said, "Oh, you mean Linux?" That was the most common response we had back then. But we got to do some really cool projects. I still have a picture of the first payment I received from my first client, which was Intel. And at that time, way back then, the entire instruction set was analyze the universe of open source projects and give us a stack that sucks the most MIPS. That was our instructions. They wanted to drive MIPS usage. Then we got to go and do some other fun things for the likes of Microsoft and HP and IBM and Sun. Some of you may remember Sun. And after doing that for about 4 or 5 years, the VCs got excited about open source. They saw Red Hat, and, largest IPO in history. And so rightly or wrongly, every VC had to check their box and say, we have an open source company in our portfolio. So for us, it was a great business model because for about 4 or 5 years, that drove about 75% of my consultancy's business, was doing due diligence. And what we stumbled upon is, I'd say about 75% of the time, we recommended against the investment for a variety of reasons. And in almost every case, they didn't listen to us and they did the deal anyway. But the good thing was they would then hire us to fix everything that we found that was the problem. I didn't set out to discover that kind of that business model, but it turned out to be a pretty good revenue generator for us for a few years. And then as the enterprise began to adopt open source, we began to spend more time working with the enterprises, large banks, financial institutions. We had a project with the Federal Reserve, helping them create their compliance licensing IP policy around open source. And that garnered the attention of a company called Black Duck Software, which at that time owned about 80 to 90% of the open source code analysis market. So they would analyze your code, look for open source compliant conflicts, licensing IP conflicts. And they actually acquired us. And that was about 10 years in. So they bought us. We became their strategy consulting arm. But during that time, I had launched something called the Open Source Think Tank, which was an event that I did with Mark Radcliffe, who was really the most senior open source attorney at DLA Piper at that time. And it was really fun. We were both wine geeks. And so we created this conference. And for 10 years, we ran it in Napa, California. And then for 5 years, we ran it in Paris, France. And basically, we started it off so we launched it because it was a great way to connect with people. We invited 120, that was a cap, 120 top open source thought leaders at the time. And we thought, hey, this is a great way to actually write off all our wine purchases. And it turned out to be just a fantastic event. We structured it a little bit differently than most conferences were at the time. And I've learned so much from so many smart people. I will always appreciate that experience. So moving forward quickly, I then went to Wipro, which is one of the large global systems integrators, about 10 billion in revenue, 250,000 employees. And I was global head of open source for Wipro. And the opportunity there was really to do open source consulting at a scale that had never been done before anywhere. And had some good successes. There were definitely some challenges, but it was an exciting experience because we got to work with, we only work with Fortune 500. And so got to work with some really interesting customers that were beginning to adopt open source as fast as they possibly could. So that was kind of a fun experience. And then as I left after 9 years, I left that. There was this little company that Wipro was a council member of called Hedera. And Hedera had reached out to Wipro and said, we need some help with our open source strategy. Is there anyone at Wipro that can help us? So they found me. And so I worked as a very part-time, 4, 5, 6 hours a week consultant for Hedera, and helping them develop their open source strategy. Wipro kind of contributed me as a council member to Hedera at that time. And then I actually, towards the end of that, I actually created they were looking for a chief open source officer. I helped them create the job description. I helped them identify candidates. And then at the end of that process, they came back and said, hey, would you consider joining us? And I was really excited at that time. I had a good experience in Wipro, but these were some of the smartest people I'd ever met. But I tell you, what I knew about crypto at that time, mainly, I had to have conversation with my wife. I'd said, we knew Binance and we saw crypto winner and all these negative headlines. And like, do I want to jump into this? But it was really there were so many smart people. That's what really got me excited. And I jumped in with both feet.
So it's a crazy jump for sure.
So that was an interesting experience. I thought dealing with financial services organizations that I understood, highly regulated environments and complex environments. And then I joined Hedera and crypto and Web3, and I began to learn what it really means to be in a highly complicated environment with a really complex ecosystem. That was a fun project. Got them to the point where they moved all their code underneath the Linux Foundation Decentralized Trust Project. Created the project Hyro that is being driven by the ecosystem today, and then left about a little under a year ago. And I've been doing some work in AI. I've been working with a large global bank, helping them open source their Gen AI framework. I'm working with a few startups around AI, health tech, health and wellness AI, and really fun. But I'm also there's something else in front of me very soon. So hopefully I'll be able to announce that some other time.
Well, that's a cool journey. So you were kind of like at the beginning of the movement, help people learn how to adopt open source. And open source back then is kind of like what AI is now, where it's part of every investment portfolio. If you're not a part of it, then you're behind. And then you got to step in, dabble into the wild west of crypto, which now there's some standard regulation framework, at least in the US. So we'll see how that navigates over the next couple of years. But how would you say the experience was for open source and how critical it is to be a part of the business strategy? Like from back then to today, like, is it essential? And then what are the items that you need to be aware of when you implement open source software, et cetera?
It's a good question. And I've always viewed my role is not to be a zealot, but to help organizations understand how they can benefit practically from open source. And whether it's a startup that's building their products on open source and trying to figure out how to create a business model around open source, or it's a large enterprise that's deploying 10,000 different open source components and now wants to begin to figure out how to contribute back and engage and participate in the ecosystem, the community. It is very important. And one of the particularly with the enterprise, one of the key aspects that I've always brought up is learn how to talk the language of your customers. Learn what matters to them. Learn how to help them be successful. There are a lot, even within an enterprise. I've dealt with so many, we get brought in lots of times by the people who are evangelizing open source in these large corporations, which is great. But they become a little, they don't understand why it's being pigeonholed, and they're not able to expand open source across the entire enterprise. It's because many times it's because they're using the wrong language. They're not understanding how to relate to executives who have different goals and objectives than they do. They're trying to push open source as has great features and functionality, and it's lower cost, and it's transparent, and blah, 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 right? They're not talking about, okay, it's going to help us introduce a new product faster. It's going to help us open a new market faster. These are what executives care about. So always helped organizations understand that. With startups, it's the same thing. Just a kind of slightly different context, but the same issue that needs to be addressed. How to speak the language of your customers. But at the end of the day, what it boils down to, if you can't build a community or an ecosystem, there is very little reason to go open source. Really. Because that's when you're able to build a community that is self-sustaining, that is loyal, that is providing sincere input to your organization, that becomes loyal customers, that helps you get into new markets, innovate faster, differentiate faster. That's what open source is about.
I'd completely agree with that. It's just better to keep it proprietary if no one's interested in your open source code or the project in general. Just keep it and build it that way.
Yeah, right. If you don't need to, and one of the most important things about that is build open source as your channel, your partner, your ecosystem. It's not just about a bunch of independent developers. That's awesome if you have that and you get some really smart people that are contributing some great stuff to your code base. But pay attention, understand who your community is, and help the people that are a member, who are employees or key partners, right? One of the things that's so important is to understand who your developers are and how to help them be successful. Right? Pay attention to their success first before you focus on your success. That is, to me, one of the magic bullets, I'd say.
Well, to that question of topic for clarification too, especially with people I interact with, what would you say, because there's two different ways you can enhance culture within an organization. Most of the time they go an open source program office route, but then there's this new fancy word called developer relations. And how would you say those can partner together, or what the distinctions are?
That's a good question. And that's one of my learnings when I came into Web3 was the whole DevRel. I mean, obviously in Web 2, you have the construct of developer relations, right? But in Web 3, it took on it has a different context. And at first, I was like, oh my god, all your people are on Discord and it's all about emojis. That's what I thought DevRel was, right? There were goals for we've got to increase our Discord participants by 500%. At the end of the day, what are they actually contributing? Now, my perspective changed over the time I spent in Web3. I see the necessity there for what I call kind of the top of the funnel. I look at it that way. I still want to help move your DevRel community or your developers down to GitHub, right? Or down to wherever your repos reside, and get them engaged in providing real substantive contributions to the code base, to the organization, right? Discord's a great place to communicate, to build excitement and energy. But again, I view it as top of the funnel. Let's help these people. Let's willow the numbers down. Let's help the key people get down to GitHub. I hope that
I
makes
think
sense.
yeah, no, it's very important. Which helps me build on to next question, which is you're very much used to that Web 2 world, especially with the heavy regulated environments. Web 3 was a wild west, and getting that developer relations. Most people are on Discord, Twitter, every other social media, and they're not, at least in my experience, they're not as professional as I would say the Web 2 world is, per se. So how would you say that learning gap is from Web 2 to Web 3 and the community and management aspects associated?
So I'll differ a little bit. In the early days of open source, you might not call some of those folks professional, right? Just kind of a different, they had their own perspective and their own culture. But I don't know that I would call even the folks in Web3 not professional. I think one of the challenges in Web3 is there's still so much money floating around. Less money creates more focus on what drives the needle, right? I love the fact when I came into Web3 and I was working on my budget and I was getting funding for our activities, I'm like, holy crap, that's a lot of money. And there's still a lot of that out there. And I think that causes people to pay less attention to some of the details. And hey, that's great. I'm not bemoaning the fact that there's this level of resources available in Web3. I think it's great. But I think bringing some discipline and focus could be helpful.
I agree with that, because that's kind of where granting and funding are not an issue in Web3. It's mostly, but people turn that grant model into their business operations rather than focusing on when does emerging tech meet commercial adoption and business use cases that way. So you get stuck in that infinite cycle, and that's one of the things I'm trying to help, at least in the Cardano space, is bring in some expertise for people to realize how they can commercialize open source, but also focus on actually going after that commercial adoption piece. Because I think the use cases are there. You just got to build what people want in that case.
Well, there you have the traditional investment community in Web3. You have the Web3 native investment community. Then you have the grant giving entities out there. But if you look at the success ratios, they're an order of magnitude less than traditional investment going on in Web2. I think part of that is just the lack of experience of some of the investment entities in Web3. They may have taken a flyer on Bitcoin a decade ago. Good for them. I didn't. I wish I did. Right? So good for them, but they've made gobs of money and now they want to put it to work and they want to invest, but they haven't come up through the investment ranks, the venture ranks. And so I think there are a number of investment entities in Web3 that simply don't have the experience or the culture. So that to me explains part of the reason why the success ratio is so much lower in Web3 than traditional investing.
I can see that. Well, with that too, I think the other thing that challenges Web 2 people in the Web 3 space is some of these ecosystems are about building digital nations and trying to reform what the failures were of geographical countries, at least in their words. So how would you say the political views on decentralization, trust fit into this gameplay, would you say?
So I'm a DAO neophyte, but I've been over the last year and a half, really trying to get up to speed, putting my feet into different DAOs and getting experience with the different models out there. I think it's fascinating. I love it. I see a massive amount of inefficiency, but that may be just due to lack of maturity, and that's fine. I think what are there, over 2,000 DAOs, something like that today. There's going to be consolidation. People are going to continue to experiment. They're going to figure what works and what doesn't work from a governance perspective. I really like the focus on open source it's about 65% of the grant giving organizations that have a real tight focus on open source requirements for grants, as Cardano does and some of the others. So I think that's important piece here. It's good to see that.
That's good. Well, and I think one of your recent blogs was about an article saying we're getting rid of the open source foundation perspectives related to governance structures, right? If I'm not mistaken.
I was doing kind of a point counterpoint on that.
Yeah.
There's an evolution. So just they're used to it's like the foundation du jour. Every day we're hearing about some new foundation.
Yeah.
And for the right organization, foundations can work. But just because you have a project that you think has the ability to be successful, don't throw it under a foundation. And it's the same variation of open source it and they will come. It's hard. It's hard to build a successful project. It's hard to build a successful foundation. So I think do it carefully and really understand why you're doing it. I'm not saying that there's not a role for them. I'm just saying that many of them are not created with enough thoughtfulness.
No, I do agree with your sentiment there. I'm not saying to do away with the models, but just because you put code on GitHub doesn't mean you're open source, and just because you're under a foundation doesn't mean you have a success. Because even the journey of pioneering Cardano to a member-based org, we tried LF. It wasn't a culture fit, so we went and set up our own MBO. It's steadily working, still a hard roadmap. We're making progress there. So,
it's always a journey.
Yeah, for sure. So my next piece to that too is definitely one of the big things with Web3 is transparency, but also where your data is owned. And AI has become a big picture into this. And I know you've done some deep thought onto that. And I wanted to open that category of where you wanted to talk about AI, because there's many questions I can ask. But where do you see or maybe we can start with a quick connection point, which is where do you think that Web3 and AI are integrating right now?
Well, open source is a foundation for both of them. That's a starting point in this particular conversation, right? If you look at what in Web3, 90% of layer ones are open source, are built on open source. 70 to 80% of dApps are built on open source. They're not all open source, but they're built on open source. In AI, it's about 65% of the 200 plus foundation models are built on open source or open source, and that's going to continue to grow. So more and more of the whole AI ecosystem is going to be open source. You see the orchestration in the toolchain layers that are now with MCP and A2A and others that are being and parts of LangChain are fully open source. Right. So as an intersection, the world of Web3 and AI is open source, right? Other intersections, why? Well, because it works, right? Open source code works. It's you can drive innovation faster using open source tooling and building an ecosystem and sharing. But it's transparency and trust, and I think trust is one of the big issues. For Web3, there's still a degree of complexity that exists that the average Web2 developer really struggles with, or the average non-developer struggles with in Web3. And I think open source can help developers understand Web3 better. With AI, it's that, but it's also about trust. Yeah. What's open and transparent gives you a higher degree of trust today.
I agree with that. There was another gentleman I was talking to who's talking about the structures behind functional programming. Cardano is primarily built on Haskell, and how AI can actually help jump that curve, considering Cardano already hires half the Haskell engineers in the world. So there needs to be a bigger user base to pull from to integrate, and AI can help fit that bridge. But to that too, as you were saying, trust. There's a big talk about doing peer-to-peer relations with different data servers and owning your data and moving away from traditional cloud-based solutions, because AI seeps into the data and takes things, quote unquote. You have any insights to that by chance?
Well, we're beginning to see more and more specialized models that will be based on, they'll be incredibly fine-tuned on smaller sets of data. That's why they're not called a foundational model, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think we're going to see a huge proliferation. I've been talking, and there's one I'm advising today that is, their data sets, let's say, the way to look at it is they will consume massive amounts of kind of general data, general purpose data, and then they will continue to fine tune it. So at the end of the day, the data that their model is actually based on is a small subset of that. And I think we're going to see more and more and more of that. We're not just going to see new organizations or new startups, but we're going to see enterprises that are essentially creating their own models, right? Because they're taking general purpose ones, foundational models, and they're fine tuning the hell out of it for their own special purposes. And I get why they're doing that, right? But it's the complexity. It's only going to increase complexity, and it's only going to increase the surface attack area, frankly. So security is going to be a larger and larger issues. I am on FINOS, the FinTech Open Source Foundation, which we're Christian, is an open source foundation dedicated to promoting open source and financial services today. Over 100 members, including most of the largest banks in the world, from BlackRock to Citi to JP Morgan to MasterCard and so on, right? Mm-hmm. And they have a number of AI initiatives. And one of the concerns that comes up in almost every single conversation is around model proliferation, model support, surface attack area that they have to guard against. So when you hear these conversations at the scale that they're talking about, it's like, holy crap, how are they going to manage this in 2 to 3 years when they're supporting dozens of different models, right? So that was the other thing. And so I'd like to see AI paying more attention to security-related issues, as I would Web3. Now, I think that's changing a bit, especially with the focus on DeFi, right? You can't throw a stick at a dApp builder without hitting 10 DeFi applications today, right? But I remember one of my first presentations when I was in Web3, and I asked a question to the audience. There's like 50, 60 people in the audience, and I said, how many of you have heard of OpenSSL? How many of you heard? And I named a couple of the security vulnerabilities. In the entire audience, 2 people raised their hand. They'd heard of these massive security-related matters. And so I began to understand that Web3 is going so fast that, and it's not universal, of course, but security is almost an afterthought. Let's build shit, let's make sure it works, and then we'll plug in security afterwards. Now with DeFi, if you're going to be selling to the enterprise, and we begin, and as financial services organizations are getting more and more and more involved in Web3, that's changing. And I think it's changing really rapidly, but it still needs a higher degree of attention.
Well, would you say Hedera had got on that ahead of time, considering the council's kind of from big tech to begin with, right? So security is always kind of a forebot. Yep,
you're absolutely right. That's a good call out. I mean, there are a lot of enterprise Web 2 organizations as council members of Hedera, and they were the conscious of the builders who were out there, creating Hashgraph. And so, yeah, they did force everyone to pay attention to it, perhaps more than some other protocols.
That's good. Well, and I know that's why we went for the functional programming academic on the Cardano space. So security was foremount, but because the dApp's building on top of, they don't think about that. That's the bottom architecture layer. And there's still one primary engineering firm with some subsidiaries, but we still got to focus security back into our picture, because everyone's more focused about governance and treasury and all that stuff right now. So it's
I get that, but security is critical, especially as Web3 begins storing it more around DeFi. they're going to be forced to pay attention to it. You now have governments that are mandating certain levels or types of security. The federal government now, if you're going to sell to the federal government, you're required to produce an S-bond. How many dApps can produce a current S-bond? That would be a really interesting question to ask, right?
Yeah. I'll be getting into that soon for my portfolio. So one thing at a time. But a good question for you, because I already know what my experience was for it, but when you came into the Hedera project, how mature was the open source practice there? Was it something easy to start from? Or was it like my situation was we had done an inner source movement. It didn't catch on because, like you're saying, language. So they ended up hating it, and we just called it better open source and pushed the same message, and everyone was okay with it.
Whatever works, right?
Yeah. But then we ended up doing a whole, like my whole open source office is more focused on the community management side of open source and driving things that way, because we already have the strong technical layer, but now we need diversity among the contributors and maintainers. And then having the grant organizations just helps give that adrenaline shot. But how was it from your side of the pond? Because I know Hedera and Cardano are very similar and kind of being outliers from other ecosystems, but different culture perspectives, I'd say. Y'all have more big tech. We have more of the independent proprietors, quote unquote. But
right.
Yeah.
Well, when I came on board, the code had already been acquired by the council from the creators and made open source. So technically, the code was open source, but there wasn't really much of a culture of, just because the code's open source doesn't mean the behavior is open source. Let's call it that. So that's what they wanted to begin to instill, is within the core builders and creators, bring in more of an open source culture, put the code out externally under an independently governed organization, and then begin to bring the ecosystem into become more engaged in contributing to the project, not necessarily at the consensus layer, but at the building, creating, contributing more dApps. Right. That's what makes a protocol successful today, is the DAOs. Right. Yeah. And how many transactions you're running across the protocols. So it was really about helping change the color, creating a governance model that respected the original creators and their team's contributions, help them be part of the management, and then yet allow other builders to be on board. So it was really a governance and a cultural issue.
Yep. Very similar.
That's why it was moved under an independently. It's the only one that's been all its code was moved under an independently governed open source foundation.
Yeah.
And the good thing is, so I understand why when you talked to the LF, why there might have been a culture change when Hedera tried that also and were rebuffed by the LF. Because at that time they were saying if you had a coin associated with your project, we weren't going to touch you. I've had a long history with the LF. I was able to help kind of move things around a little bit so that they did accept us. And today they're an important part of the LFDP project.
Yeah, 100%. Daniela and Hart do a good job there.
Yeah, they
help
do.
foster things. Yeah, we partnered with them. Mostly we did have that talk, but it was also limitations on who could participate on the project and stuff. So we did the other route and set up Intersect, etc. But we're still close partners at the LF on many things.
Well, one thing I'd like to comment on is going back to one of the questions you asked 5-6 minutes ago about why open source. It's not what you asked, but it's kind of what you meant. And my comment was, if you can't build a community or ecosystem, there's no real reason to do that. And one thing I would like to convey, so this part, don't edit it out. You can edit lots of other stuff out, but don't edit this out, is what the Web3 community has to recognize. If you look at the Electric Capital report, they say there's around 24,000 active monthly open source developers in Web3. I think that's really undercounted, and I think they recognize that. I had conversations with them last year, and I think they recognize they're undercounting it, but that's, to the best of their ability, that's what they've been able to identify. So let's double it. Say there are 50,000 developers in the Web3 ecosystem today. GitHub has 100 million. Now, that includes bots and so on. But if you average the different analyst reports, you can comfortably say there's somewhere between 45 to 60 million developers out there, open source developers out there today. So the Web3 community has to recognize they are just a tiny, tiny, tiny little piece of the overall global developer ecosystem. And they should recognize that as a massive opportunity, right? And I would love to see the protocols, right? I think it has to be led by the chains, really working harder to make it easier for Web2 developers to get more engaged in Web3. I think that's and they haven't done a good job so far. They haven't. It's so hard. It's so hard to make that transition. Now thousands of them do it every month, but then they leave, or things are so complicated they're not productive. Right. One of the data points I saw is 70 or 80% of all code contributions are done by developers who have been in Web3 more than 2 or 3 years. Right? You have to bring in fresh blood to this ecosystem.
100%. That's what I'm trying to do with partnering with LF to overcome those challenges. How do you I'm trying to come up with the hitchhiker's guide to Web3.
Oh, that's good. I like that.
Try to get something that's the For Dummies catalog, and then you build from there. Because it's also, I hate to say it, but I feel like, at least I can say this for Cardano because they've proven it and I've tested this saying, but like most ecosystems in Web 2, you have developers and communities. In Web 3, you have developers, businesses, not communities, businesses. And then you have the anarchists with the political ideologies. And that's usually the learning curve. Those are the developers you need to learn from and contribute with because they build the biggest base of it. But yeah, to your point. And if you had to say things for Web 2 people to look for in Web 3, or like what are key takeaways that you could learn from the Web 3 space that doesn't exist in Web 2 in relation to the technology?
Well, I'm a big blockchain fan, obviously. Right. Blockchain and Web 2 is you'll see the banks, the large banks, for example, they're all building their own blockchains, private. Some of them even begin to participate publicly. Right? But it's this notion. Web 3 is still it's still so complicated. You have Web 2 benefited from the fact that there was Microsoft and then there is Linux. Right, from an operating system, there were
a unified foundation, kind of,
so on. But really, so now there's much more standardization in Web 2. It's easier to understand. In Web 3, every protocol, right, is fighting and promoting themselves. How much differentiation? How much true business differentiation is there? I'm not so sure. All right. So what can Web 2 learn from Web 3? I think this notion of decentralization is awesome. I really think when executed well, the security implications of decentralization are just awesome. Right. I think that's something that Web 2 could pay more attention to. Then there's the reverse. Web 3 may not want to hear it, but I still think there's a lot they can learn from Web 2, and that's a focus on on truly being compatible. Making sure that things can be interoperable cross chain. I see that there is definitely, obviously, there's a lot of progress there. EVM is the most popular ecosystem out there today, right? So there's a lot of progress, but I think there needs to continue to be. You can still compete and yet focus on being interoperable.
Yeah.
Because if at the end of the day, you've got to ask yourself, if the only reason I exist is because I'm not interoperable, what's your true value?
Yeah. You'll
right?
have a niche of people maybe to build it around, but
Yeah.
you'll just be a legacy at that point, or at one point in the future. But I think it's good too, because to your point, most chains are very similar. The only things that kind of differ is how they develop, how they govern, but the same basic functions are all there. Maybe identity is a differentiation factor, or security implementations, um, and downtime, transactions per second, but it's still the same base layer, like 80% of the same sandwich, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
but I do think your points are spot on for sure. Because even so, I actually come from a different open source background. I was a very avid gamer of Bethesda Softworks, and they decided that they would open their creation engine to their gamer base, and
Mhm.
the modding community started from that point forward. I think Skyrim, even though you can't make any money off their stuff, even though they're trying to do a closed, they pay people who develop apps or mods, and you buy it the mod through their page, so they get a cut of it. But there's like a million mods for Skyrim, give or take, that change everything. You can. It's funny because you'll overmesh your horse with like a Nissan GTR, so it's galloping. But yeah, I think that's kind of the ethos of open source that companies can kind of utilize for sure. But I know we're coming close to time. What would you say, closing remarks, if you could leave tech leaders with one mandate about open source and AI and Web3, what would it be?
It's a big question. Um,
Feel free to take time. We can cut any of the long thought.
okay. Well, one, there's more commonality than difference. Recognize that, right? Um, and it may sound trite, but there is a very, very strong business rationale for sharing, for being open and being transparent. Right? I'm not a zealot. I'm not here to say it's just good because it's good. It's good because think of it, that it's good because there is a business imperative to it, and pay attention to that. Learn what that imperative actually is. If executed well, and one, open source isn't just about a license. You have to match. Open source is about a license that grants certain rights and freedoms. It's also about behaviors. And you have to walk the talk. If you're going to tell the community you're doing something, you better do that something, or be open and honest and transparent with them. Right? It goes much, much farther than you would possibly believe to do that. I've seen so many bait and switches over the years. I've seen so many who were actually honest and sincere, and they made all sorts of commitments to their community that they had every intention of being able to carry through, but they had no ability to do it. So open source is a license and it's a set of behaviors, and pay attention to the behaviors. Right? Behaviors over time is what makes you successful.
Well, that's a good point and food for thought for sure. Because to your end, it's not about jumping in the hype of the community. It actually can tie to business impacts, and if you scale it right, you'll go somewhere. I know. Wanted to leave the opportunity for you to talk about your teaser you mentioned earlier before. So, floor is yours.
Well, I am trying to get my act together so I can actually participate in Fund 14 here. This is an idea that has come to me because of a unique path that I've had, right? Open source for 25 years, but I've also spent time in Web3, and I've spent time in AI. What has been a consistent thread throughout this is security and security related challenges around software security in particular, software supply chain security even more specifically. So I believe I have come up with a model leveraging some open source constructs that exist today, that are standards today, that can be used to provide security to new AI models for the consumers. That is based on the blockchain, and potentially on Originate, which is Cardano's new platform for supply chain management platform. So really, it's using an open source standard that involves AI models actually self-attesting to the validity of their SBOMs and peer attestations to validity of SBOMs that reside immutably on a blockchain.
That's an awesome
That's my teaser.
thing. Well, I think that's a big gap that's definitely needed to be filled, and it's cool to tie that Web3 backend to it. Because I also was very interested in CF's new project that way, so it's cool to see a use case for that, for sure.
Have to build it, but yeah. I have a use case now. I have to make it real.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I do appreciate your time, Andrew. Thank you for all your thought leadership. Hopefully I can catch you again in the future as your project evolves and things, granted all funding and everything works out well for you.
Thank you very much, Christian. I appreciate everything. I enjoyed participating on your open source project. I hope that's successful, and I wish you the best of luck with that.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Okay.